wonder if I asked you the question this morning, how far would you go to find treasure of infinite worth? What kind of journey would you be prepared to take if you were convinced that at the end of it, you would get to behold something unlike anything you've ever seen in this world? What would you need to know in order to take the journey in the first place? Well, Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12 shows us how some people were prepared to take the longest journey in search of Jesus, whilst others resisted even taking the smallest step towards him. You know, the Magi in Matthew chapter 2 were compelled to endure the longest journey in search of ultimate treasure. In truth, we're not given a lot of information about these mysterious travelers, and actually there's a lot of misinformation about them in our popular Christmas carols and traditions. But here is what we do know about them. Firstly, that they were Gentiles from somewhere in the East. Now, we don't know where exactly for sure, but it could have been the likes of Babylon, Persia, Egypt, or even the Arabian Desert. They would have been well-educated and influential men who held prominent roles in both religion and politics in their own land. So they would have studied things such as astronomy, philosophy, religion, and wisdom. Obviously, they had some knowledge of the Jewish teachings. However, as Gentiles, they didn't have nearly as much knowledge as the Jews did, which some of their questions in this passage really indicate. However, what they did know prompted them to take a long and arduous journey. In fact, we can work out from the timeline of the other Gospels that the Magi had been traveling for almost 2 years before they discovered Jesus, who by this time is now a child. And we know that they would have likely traveled over hundreds, if not thousands of miles. This was not a short trip that they were taking. They gave their whole selves to this journey. But why? Well, they did it because they had seen the emergence of this star in the night sky, which indicated to them that the King of the Jews had been born. Now, what did they understand about that? Well, many commentators suggest that they were familiar with the prophecy of Balaam that we find in Numbers chapter 24. If you're familiar with the story, you'll know that Balaam was a Gentile from the east, and he was a seer who was summoned by the king of Moab to curse the people of Israel during their time of the wilderness wanderings. However, instead of cursing them, Balaam ends up blessing them because God tells him to do so. And in his prophetic words that we read in Numbers 24, he speaks about how in the future, out of Israel will arise a ruler who will destroy Israel's enemies, and that associated with this ruler will be a star, the Star of Jacob. Now, Balaam's prophecy came to be associated with the birth of the coming Messiah, who would derive from the line of David and who, unlike earthly kings, would establish an everlasting kingdom. So this king would be a king like no other. So the Magi knew that the rising of this star meant the birth of a king, but not just any earthly king, the Messiah. And it was all they needed to know in order to take the journey to find him. But you know, the ultimate reason that they sought to find him, Matthew tells us, is that they wanted to worship him. Now, this wasn't mere curiosity or intrigue at play in the minds of these mysterious, well-educated and prominent men. This was something far deeper. You see, we only worship something if we feel as though it is something of infinite worth. These men were used to being well respected, and yet when they encountered the child Jesus, they adored him as someone who was in every way superior to them. They bowed down before him. They worshipped him. They gave him gifts, which was the custom that you would do when you met someone who was superior to you. It was not an earthly king they'd come to see, but a heavenly one. The Magi knew that this king was not just for Israel, but would be a king for the entire world, including them. And so they came to not just see him, but to bend the knee before him. To them, he was far more precious than anything else they had come across in all the earth. In all their searching for wisdom and truth and goodness and meaning, as they studied the night skies for understanding, As they sought the wisdom of the ages, it was right there at the foot of this child where their journey ended. To find him was to discover what the human heart was made for, to worship and commune with the living God. And if that meant leaving their homeland and embracing a long journey with only the testimony of a star to go on, then so be it. They would go so far in order to find him. But of course, not everyone in Matthew 2 bothered to make the journey. And Matthew gives an account of not only those who discovered Jesus, but those who missed Jesus altogether. When the Magi arrive in Jerusalem, they go and seek the counsel of Herod about where the Messiah is. Now, Herod is the current king in Israel, and he consults the chief priests and the teachers of the law, who are effectively the worship leaders and preachers of the Jewish faith. And they know exactly where the Messiah is to be born. He's to be born in Bethlehem. But here's the curious thing. It's only about 7 miles between Jerusalem to Bethlehem. It's comparatively a short journey. And yet these chief priests and these teachers of the law don't even bother to go and investigate what these mysterious travelers have come so far to see. It seems as though they're indifferent. Why? Well, maybe they were so comfortable with the status quo. Maybe they just got really comfortable with the way things stood and their place in it. Maybe they enjoyed the trappings and rituals of their religion, but failed to see the one to whom it all points. Perhaps it was their religious arrogance that prevented them from really seeing. What we do know is that they knew all there was to know, and yet they failed to see the treasure that was right there in front of them. And then, of course, there was Herod and those with political power and influence within Jerusalem. And Matthew tells us that when they hear the news from the Magi, that far from being indifferent, they are disturbed by it. Herod is so disturbed that he devises a plan to destroy Jesus. Why? Because Herod is threatened by Jesus and doesn't want to have to relinquish his crown. The existence of Jesus Christ, who held the right to the throne of David, meant that Herod would have to step aside, lay down his crown, and acknowledge Jesus as the rightful king. And his pride just couldn't let him do it. Instead of coming to Jesus, he rejects Jesus and misses out on what only the greater king can give. So in Matthew 2, we find when it comes to Jesus that there are 3 responses. The Magi sought him and adored him. The religious leaders knew about him but missed him. And Herod, threatened by him, rejected him. So let me ask you, how far are you prepared to go to find the one of infinite worth? And when you find him, how will you greet him? You know, some people who've never been to church and who are not familiar with Jesus, they would go to any lengths in order to find ultimate treasure, in order to find the key that unlocks the fullness of life. They would go to great lengths to discover the truth, goodness, beauty, and meaning that we have found in Jesus Christ, the eternal King. There is no limit to how far they would go to find it. And yet for those of us in church, he is right in front of us. What they would take 1,000 steps in the hope of finding, we don't even bother to reach out and grab hold of us when he's right in front of our face. You know, sadly, we may have grown up with church and be all too familiar with Jesus. We might know all there is to know and all the creeds and all the answers to the Sunday school questions. And yet, at the same time, we have not experienced him for the treasure he is, simply because we've not been prepared to truly seek him, to lay down our crown and to bow the knee before him. Of course, one of the dangers of this time of year is that it's possible for us to go through this Christmas season with all its busyness and totally miss the Christ to whom it all testifies. To totally miss him, to miss out on seeking him and knowing him, to miss out on worshiping him and communing with him when he's right there in front of us, longing for us to come. And so as we pray that so many would discover Christ this Christmas, maybe the prayer for our own souls today is that we might rediscover him for the treasure he is.